Have you ever felt that your struggles are too great for God to use you? What if I told you that it's precisely in those struggles that His purpose is revealed? Life has a way of pressing down on us, making us feel small, insignificant, or even forgotten. You may think that your circumstances are proof that you've been abandoned or overlooked, but the truth is quite the opposite. The very pain you're experiencing might be the stage God is setting for His greatest work in your life. Think about this for a moment. Why does God allow struggle? Why do we face battles that seem impossible to win? It's because battles prepare us. Struggles refine us. It's in the hardest moments that our true character is forged. But here's the key. You don't have to face those battles alone. God is with you, even when it feels like He's silent. And His silence isn't absence, it's preparation. Imagine standing at the edge of a battlefield, looking at an enemy so much larger than you. Maybe you've felt like this before, staring down the giants in your life. Giants of debt, giants of sickness, giants of failure. Those giants look undefeatable, and they taunt you, making you question your strength, your faith, and even your purpose. But here's the thing. Your victory isn't about your strength. It's about who fights for you. There are moments in life when we think we're too broken, too flawed, or too far gone to be of any use to God. But do you know what the Bible says? It says, God is close to the brokenhearted. It says, He chooses the weak to shame the strong. God isn't waiting for you to become perfect. He's waiting for you to trust Him with your imperfection. Let me tell you something powerful. The very thing you think disqualifies you is the thing God wants to use. Your pain, your failure, your fear, they're not obstacles, they're opportunities. Opportunities for Him to show His power through you. Look at the stories in the Bible. Who did God choose? It wasn't the kings with armies or the scholars with wisdom. He chose shepherds, fishermen, our outcasts, and sinners. Why? Because His strength is made perfect in weakness. Picture this. A young boy named David, a shepherd with no military training, standing before a giant named Goliath. Goliath was a warrior, a massive, intimidating force trained to kill. David, on the other hand, had nothing but a sling, 5 stones, and faith. Did he feel fear? Maybe. Did he feel unqualified? Probably. But here's what David knew. The battle wasn't his, it was God's. And that's what you need to know today. Your battles, no matter how overwhelming they seem, don't belong to you alone. They belong to God. But here's the catch. He's waiting for you to invite Him into the fight. He's waiting for you to lay down your doubts, your fears, and your need for control and say, Lord, I trust you. What if I told you that the pain you're feeling right now is not punishment, but preparation? What if I told you that the tears you've cried are not wasted, but are watering the seeds of something beautiful? What if I told you that this battle isn't the end, but the beginning? You've been chosen, not because you're perfect, but because God's power shines brightest in imperfection. You've been chosen, not because you have all the answers, but because you're willing to trust the one who does. You've been chosen, not to avoid the battle, but to walk into it knowing you're not alone. You see, God doesn't just see where you are. He sees where you're going. He doesn't just see your scars. He sees your healing. He doesn't just see your brokenness. He sees your breakthrough. But you have to believe it. You have to take that step of faith, even when it feels like the ground beneath you is shaking. Your story isn't over. The pain you've endured, the failures you've experienced, they're not meant to break you. They're meant to shape you. You're stronger than you think. And more importantly, you're never alone. God is with you, even in the silence. And His silence doesn't mean He's forgotten you. It means He's working behind the scenes, setting up something greater than you can imagine. So let me ask you, will you trust Him? Will you lay your struggles at His feet and believe that He can turn them into something beautiful? Will you let go of the fear that says you're not enough and grab hold of the faith that says He is more than enough? Your struggles aren't meaningless. They're the setup for a greater plan. What you see as the end is often just the beginning of a new chapter. The tears you've cried, the battles you've fought, they all have a purpose. God is working, even when you can't see it. The question is, will you let Him? We all face moments of doubt, fear, and frustration, times when it feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders, and every step forward seems to push you 2 steps back. Maybe you're there right now. Maybe you're looking at your life and wondering why it's so hard. Why does it feel like the battles never end? Why does it feel like no matter how much you pray, the answers just don't come? These are questions every believer wrestles with at some point. But let me tell you something, you are not alone in this struggle. Think about the story of David and Goliath. It's a story we often hear as children, but its depth goes far beyond the surface. Imagine this: a young shepherd boy with no formal training, no armor, and no weapons of war, standing before a giant who had terrified even the most seasoned warriors. Goliath wasn't just big. He was a symbol of insurmountable odds. He was a walking reminder of everything Israel feared. And yet, David didn't run, he didn't hide, he stepped forward. Why? Was it because he thought he was stronger than Goliath? No. Was it because he believed he had more skill? Not at all. David stepped forward because he understood one thing: the battle wasn't his to fight alone. But let's pause here. How often do you feel like you're standing in front of your own Goliath? Maybe it's not a literal giant, but it feels just as impossible to overcome. Maybe it's the crushing weight of debt that keeps you up at night. Maybe it's the diagnosis you weren't prepared for. Maybe it's the loss of a relationship, the betrayal of a friend, or the overwhelming sense of inadequacy that whispers, "You're not enough." These are the battles we all face in different forms. And just like David, it's easy to feel small, unqualified, and unprepared. You might be asking yourself right now, why would God allow this in my life? If He loves me, why does He let me struggle? Let's be honest, that's a hard question. But here's the truth: struggles aren't meant to destroy you. They're meant to prepare you. They're meant to teach you how to lean on God in ways you never have before. Think about it. If life were always easy, would you ever truly rely on Him? Would you ever recognize the depth of His power, His love, and His grace? The giants in your life are not there to defeat you. They're there to refine you. David could have easily focused on his fear. He could have looked at Goliath and thought, "I'm just a shepherd. What do I have to offer? How could I possibly make a difference?" But he didn't. Instead, he looked at Goliath and remembered the God who had already delivered him from the lion and the bear. He remembered that the same God who had been faithful in the past would be faithful again. Now think about your own life. How often do we forget what God has already done for us? How often do we focus so much on the giant in front of us that we lose sight of the victories He's already given us? Maybe you've faced hardship before and somehow you made it through. Maybe you've cried out in desperation and God answered in ways you didn't expect. If He was faithful then, what makes you think He won't be faithful now? But let's get real for a moment. It's not always easy to trust, is it? When the pressure is mounting and the answers seem distant, it's easy to give in to fear. It's easy to believe the lie that says, you're on your own. That's exactly what the enemy wants you to believe. He wants you to feel isolated, abandoned, and forgotten. But let me remind you of something powerful. You are never alone. The Bible tells us time and time again that God is with us. He is our refuge and strength, our ever-present help in trouble. But here's the thing, you have to invite Him into the battle. David didn't walk onto that battlefield trusting in his own strength. He walked onto it declaring, "The Lord will deliver me." He wasn't fighting for victory, he was fighting from a place of victory because he knew who his God was. So what about you? What are you facing today that feels too big, too heavy, too impossible? Maybe it's the crushing burden of financial struggle. You're trying to make ends meet, but no matter how hard you work, it feels like you're sinking deeper. Maybe it's the heartbreak of watching a loved one suffer, knowing there's nothing you can do to fix it. Or maybe it's the relentless voice in your head telling you that you'll never be good enough, that you'll never measure up, that you'll never escape the pain of your past. Whatever it is, know this: the same God who was with David is with you. The same God who parted the Red Sea, who healed the sick, who raised the dead. That same God is fighting for you. But you have to trust him. You have to stop trying to carry it all on your own and lay it at his feet. There's a beautiful verse in the Bible that says, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." Think about that for a moment. God isn't distant. He isn't indifferent to your pain. He cares. He sees every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. And he's not just watching from a distance. He's walking with you, even when you can't feel it. You see, the problem isn't that God isn't there. The problem is that we're often too busy looking at the giant to see him. We're so focused on the problem that we forget the one who holds the solution. But here's the good news. It's never too late to turn your eyes back to him. It's never too late to say, "Lord, I can't do this on my own. I need you." So let me ask you, what's your Goliath? What's the thing that's keeping you awake at night, stealing your peace, and making you feel like giving up? Whatever it is, know this. You don't have to face it alone. The battle isn't yours, it's God's. And just like David, you already have everything you need to face it. Not because of your own strength, but because of his. Your giants may be big, but your God is bigger. The question is, will you trust him? If you're standing face to face with your giant today, it's easy to feel like the odds are stacked against you. You may feel small, unworthy, or unprepared. But here's the truth. God never intended for you to fight alone. The battle has always been his, and he's inviting you to trust him like never before. When David stood before Goliath, he didn't rely on his own strength or abilities. He didn't have the physical power, the weapons, or the experience to win. What he did have was an unshakable belief in God's promises. David knew something critical. The God who had been faithful in the past would be faithful again. And that same truth applies to you. No matter what you're facing, God has not left you without resources. The question is, are you using them? Are you standing in faith? Or are you trying to fight this battle in your own strength? Let me show you how God equips you to face your giants and overcome them. First, he gives you his promises. One of the most powerful reminders comes from Isaiah 41:10. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." This isn't just a comforting thought, it's a declaration. God is saying, "You're not in this alone. I'm with you every step of the way." But how do you hold on to that promise when everything around you feels like it's falling apart? The answer is faith. Faith isn't about ignoring your reality. It's about believing that God is greater than your reality. Faith is what allows you to look at your circumstances and say, "I don't know how this will work out, but I trust the one who does." Think back to David. He didn't walk onto that battlefield with blind optimism. He walked onto it with faith rooted in experience. He remembered how God had delivered him from the lion and the bear. Those victories, as small as they might have seemed at the time, prepared him for the greater challenge ahead. And the same is true for you. Every struggle, every trial, every moment of doubt, they've all been preparing you for this moment. But faith isn't just believing that God can. It's acting as though he already has. David didn't just stand on the sidelines and pray for Goliath to disappear. He took action. He picked up his sling, gathered his stones, and stepped onto the battlefield. That's what faith looks like. It's stepping forward, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed, because you trust that God is in control. So what does stepping forward look like for you? Maybe it's making that phone call you've been avoiding. Maybe it's forgiving someone who hurt you. Maybe it's taking a leap of faith in your career or your relationships. Whatever it is, know this. Faith requires movement. But here's the good news. You don't have to rely on your own strength. God promises to strengthen you, to help you, and to uphold you. His power is made perfect in your weakness. That means the very areas where you feel the most inadequate are the places where His glory shines the brightest. Now, let's talk about perspective. One of the biggest mistakes we make is focusing more on the size of the giant than the size of our God. Goliath wasn't just big. He was terrifying. He taunted the Israelites, making them believe they were too weak, too small, too incapable. And isn't that exactly what our struggles do to us? They whisper lies, telling us that we're not enough, that we'll never overcome, that we are destined to fail. But here's the truth. The giant's size doesn't matter when God is on your side. The same God who created the universe, who parted the Red Sea, who raised the dead, that same God is fighting for you. The question is, do you believe it? One of the most powerful examples of this comes from the life of Jesus. When he walked on water, he called Peter to join him. At first, Peter stepped out in faith, and he actually walked on the water. But the moment he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the wind and the waves, he began to sink. The same is true for us. As long as we focus on God, we can do the impossible. But the moment we let fear and doubt take over, we start to sink. So how do you keep your eyes on God when everything around you is screaming for your attention? It starts with surrender. Surrendering doesn't mean giving up, it means giving over. It means saying, Lord, I can't do this on my own. I need you. It's in that moment of surrender that His strength becomes your strength. Another key is gratitude. It's hard to be overwhelmed by your problems when you're overwhelmed by gratitude. Even in the darkest moments, there's always something to be thankful for. Gratitude shifts your focus from what you lack to what you have, from the size of your problems to the greatness of your God. But perhaps the most important step is obedience. Sometimes God calls us to do things that don't make sense. He might ask you to step out of your comfort zone, to take a risk, to trust Him in ways you never have before. That's what David did. He could have stayed with the sheep where it was safe and familiar, but he chose to step into the unknown because he trusted that God's plan was greater than his fear. And here's the beautiful part. When you take that step of faith, God meets you there. He doesn't expect you to have it all figured out. He just asks for your willingness. Because when you're willing, He's able. Your victory doesn't depend on your strength, your skill, or your resources. It depends on your surrender. It depends on your willingness to let go of your fears and trust that God is who He says He is. The battle isn't yours to win, it's His. And when you let Him fight for you, you'll see victories you never thought possible. So let me ask you, what's holding you back? What's stopping you from trusting God with your battles? Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's doubt. Maybe it's the belief that you're too broken, too flawed, too far gone. But let me remind you of something. God doesn't call the perfect, He perfects the called. And you, my friend, have been called. The battle you're facing isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning. It's the place where God is going to show up and show out in ways you can't even imagine. The question is, will you let Him? Every struggle has a purpose. Every tear you've cried, every sleepless night, every unanswered question, they're not wasted. They're part of a bigger story, a divine masterpiece that God is writing through your life. But here's the thing. To see that masterpiece, you need to trust the author. You need to let go of the fear, the doubt, and the control, and allow God to lead you into the purpose He's prepared for you. Let's be real. Trust isn't easy. When the pain feels unbearable and the answers seem distant, it's tempting to give up. It's tempting to believe that God has forgotten you. But I'm here to remind you, God has not forgotten you. He's working in ways you cannot see, and He's preparing you for something greater than you can imagine. Think about a seed. When it's planted in the ground, it's buried in darkness. To the outside world, it looks like nothing is happening. But underneath the soil, there's growth, there's transformation, and in time, that seed breaks through the surface and becomes something beautiful. That's what God is doing in your life right now. You might feel buried, but you're not forgotten. You're being prepared. Let me tell you something. The same God who created the universe, who hung the stars in the sky and called them by name, is the same God who calls you by name. He sees you. He knows your struggles. And He's not just watching from a distance. He's walking with you through the fire. He's holding you up when you feel like you can't stand. He's fighting for you when you feel like you've lost the battle. And here's the promise. God will never leave you or forsake you. It doesn't matter how far you've strayed, how many mistakes you've made, or how broken you feel. His love is relentless. His grace is sufficient. And His power is made perfect in your weakness. But there's a question you need to answer. Are you willing to trust Him? Are you willing to lay your burdens at His feet and believe that He can turn your pain into purpose? Because the truth is, God can't work in a heart that's closed off. He can't transform a life that's unwilling to let Him in. This is your moment. This is your opportunity to say, God, I surrender. I can't do this on my own, but I trust You. And when you do that, something powerful happens. The weight you've been carrying begins to lift. The chains that have held you back begin to break. And you begin to see the world not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of faith. Remember this: God doesn't waste pain. He uses it to shape you, to refine you, and to prepare you for the purpose He has for you. The very thing you thought would destroy you is the thing He will use to strengthen you. The very battle you thought you couldn't win is the battle He will use to display His power. You might be wondering, but what if I fail? What if I take a step of faith and it doesn't work out? Let me tell you this: failure isn't the end. Failure is a stepping stone. Every time you fall, God is there to pick you up. Every setback is a setup for a comeback. Your story isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning. The Bible's full of stories of people who thought they were too broken, too flawed, or too insignificant to be used by God. Moses had a stutter. Gideon was full of doubt. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and yet God used them to change the world. Why? Because they were willing to say yes. They were willing to trust Him even when it didn't make sense. And that's what He's asking of you today. He's not asking for perfection. He's asking for your heart. He's asking for your willingness. He's asking for your trust. So, what will you do? Will you keep carrying the weight of your struggles on your own? Or will you give them to God and let Him turn them into something beautiful? The choice is yours. But let me remind you, God's plans for you are greater than anything you could ever imagine. His ways are higher than your ways, and His thoughts are higher than your thoughts. He sees the big picture when all you can see is the pain. Now is the time to take that step of faith. Now is the time to declare, God, I trust You. I don't know how this will work out, but I believe You are working all things together for my good. If this message has spoken to your heart, don't let it stop here. Share it. Someone you know might be fighting a battle they haven't told anyone about. Someone you know might need the reminder that they're not alone, that God is with them, and that their story isn't over. And as you share this message, remember this: you are part of God's plan. Your life, your story, your testimony, they matter. They have the power to inspire, to encourage, and to bring hope to others. So don't hold back. Let God use you. Before we end, I want to leave you with one final truth. God has a purpose for every tear you've cried. Every battle has meaning. Every struggle has significance. And every setback is part of a divine setup for something greater. This is not the end. This is the beginning of something beautiful. Trust Him if you believe this. If you're ready to take that step of faith, leave an amen in the comments below. Let this be your declaration, your moment of surrender, your turning point. And as you do, remember this: God has not forgotten you. Your purpose is still alive. Your story is still being written. Trust Him.